Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for June 9th, 2023. And I think there's probably a ton of warnings from throughout history that show us that tyranny often goes hand in hand with people, powerful people, controlling and manipulating language. And today I'm going to share with you 4 examples out of many. It was hard to narrow it down, but 4 examples that I think are interesting that we've seen happen under the Constitution. But first, we have to start out with the fact that the Constitution in and of itself is a legal document. It's not poetry. And like any legal document, the traditional view is that it has the same legal meaning today as it was understood to have the moment it was given legal force, as it was understood by the people who gave it legal force. So that is the people of the several states in the ratifying conventions. James Madison described it this way in an 1824 letter to Henry Lee. He said, "I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution." So if you're not looking back, if you're just listening to court cases or commentators, me included, and you're not looking to see how the people of the several states understood the Constitution, whatever part of it, at the time it was ratified, then this is not the legitimate Constitution. You might get it right, but many times you won't. He said, "And if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable, more than for a faithful exercise of its powers." Mike Maharrey describes it like this. He says, "America's founding document essentially serves as a contract between the people of the states." And a lot of people want us to think that the meaning of the words can just change over time based on political whims, based on what the courts happen to say, based on what is needed, whatever. Living, breathing Constitution. And Maharrey says you can't have a living, breathing contract. You can't have a living, breathing legal document of any kind. He said, think about it. Would you sign a living, breathing agreement with a builder to put an addition on your house? In essence, if you give somebody else the power to change the meaning of a legal document, of a contract with you, they have total control over you. And we see this, or at least in that scenario, and under the Constitution, it hits anything and everything. Mike says contractual provisions have a fixed meaning. When you sign on the dotted line, you expect them to remain constant. Over time, when disagreements come up, both parties argue their position based on how they understood the contract when they signed it. And James Madison talked about this as well. He said, "If the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject." So if you allow them to change the meaning over time, well, then government is going to have a completely different structure than what was intended. And there is a way to change it in the document itself, so that's violating the whole system. Now, Rob Natelson is discussing in this article that there's a lot of legal language in the document itself. He said the framers wrote the Constitution with Anglo-American jurisprudence in mind. In 2016, he did an article where he listed 68 words and phrases in the Constitution that derive directly or indirectly from 18th century English law. Now, if the average person is supposed to understand it, why is there so much legal language? And he's asking that question. Why did they insert so many legal terms? Well, because first of all, the average educated person certainly was far more familiar with legal language then than we are today. It's not that we don't have the information available, but people just have shunned it, have no interest. They haven't learned it or even tried. And that's unfortunate. But in part, Rob says, it was also unavoidable. The Constitution is a legal document, and if the framers had tried to explain everything in ordinary language, the Constitution would have stretched from here to Cincinnati. He said it would have been immensely long. And Madison discusses this as well. He said, what a metamorphosis, talking about the ancient legal language in it, what a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. He said that the language of our Constitution is already undergoing interpretations unknown to its founders. As of 1824, he was seeing that there were words being defined differently that would have been so different that it'd be unknown to the founders, the people who gave it legal force. And here are 4 ways that we see it playing out in modern times. And it started pretty early, especially with the term necessary, which originally meant necessary. But then Alexander Hamilton in 1791, he wanted a national bank and suddenly made the case that necessary meant useful or convenient, really. And Thomas Jefferson responded to that with this: "It has been urged that a bank will give great facility or convenience in the collection of taxes. Suppose this were true, yet the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient for effecting the enumerated powers." And I covered this in some detail in an article last fall, and from there, in the 18th, and I'm going to link to all these source documents and articles in the show notes in a couple of hours when I publish it after the stream is done, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But here from the article: in the 1819 case of McCulloch versus Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall, surprise, surprise, ultimately sided with the Hamiltonian view, writing that, quote, "If reference be had to its use in the common affairs of the world, we find that it frequently imports no more than that one thing is convenient or useful or essential to another." So essential is closer to necessary, but convenient or useful is far different. So in some parts of his opinion, he copied Hamilton almost word for word, and we're living with that today. Jefferson warned of a major problem with that view. He said, "If such a latitude of construction be allowed to this phrase as to give any non-enumerated power, it will go to everyone. For there is not one which ingenuity may not torture into a convenience in some instance or another." So that's the first one. Necessary is supposed to mean necessary. Now it means convenient. Well, how about post roads? You may think this is a small deal, but a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, as Jefferson told us, is to give them a boundless field of power. And many people believe that the power delegated to Congress over post roads means they have control in some way or final authority or total authority over any road that the post office drives over or anything that the mail goes over. But this is far more expansive than how the founders and ratifiers understood the phrase post offices and post roads. And Nadelson writes that the framers borrowed the phrase established post offices and post roads from British postal statutes. It encompassed building post offices and intercity roads. These were roads that were marked by posts, similar to modern mile markers. So in essence, they had whatever was necessary and customary to develop a working postal system and an intercity highway system, not every road in existence. And Rob did a really long, interesting law review article, 74 pages. If you want to geek out, and I'll link to it in the show notes, the original meaning of the Constitution's postal clause. Next up is the power to regulate commerce, which I know you're not surprised to hear. But Nadelson puts it this way: for the nation's first 150 years, the courts and almost everyone else understood that the Interstate Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, I think Clause 3, gave Congress authority only over certain economic activities, particularly mercantile trade, and only when those activities extended across state lines. So very, very specific. And it also excluded, Rob writes, other economic activities like manufacturing, agriculture, mining, the production part of it, real estate transactions, most kinds of insurance. Plus, it excluded non-economic activities, crimes of passion, marriage and divorce, religion and morality. They're all over all of this stuff today and even more. But since that first 150 years, several writers, this is from Federalist Society, favoring a more interventionist federal government, have claimed the word commerce to be more expansive. And check out the last name on this first dude. In the FDR, the New Deal era, in 1937, just keeping the tradition alive with the name, Walton Dale Hamilton. Surprise. And along with Douglas Adair, argued that the founders understood commerce to comprehend all economic relationships, not just mercantile trade going across state lines and some associated things, but all economic relationships, including production as well as trade. And the effect of adopting this view is to authorize, even without the expansive, convenient view of necessary and proper, congressional regulation of all economic transactions triggering interstate externalities, which for practical purposes means the entire American economy. And that's not the end of it. They're trying to expand it even more. And some leading scholars like Jack Balkin, Akhil Amar, highly respected, well-known, but they take the position that's even broader, that commerce actually means human interaction of all forms, economic and non-economic. So it's not just mercantile trade across state lines. It's basically anything and everything. They've got a couple of these clauses at least now where they can just get rid of the rest of the Constitution and the whole Constitution is just necessary and proper, convenient to whatever else they want to do, or commerce. So that's a third one. And the last up for today, I want to talk about the word war. Now, the founders considered the question of war and peace to be one of the most important parts of the Constitution. James Madison, thought it was the wisest part of the Constitution was to separate the power of declaring war from the power of waging war. Declaring in the legislature, waging in the executive. And here's how he put it in Political Observations in 1795. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. And that's why they wanted it separated. A single person being able to make those decisions is going to guarantee you're going to have way more of those decisions to go into war. And here from an article that I wrote maybe a decade ago, I'll link to it in the show notes. Confronted with the constitutional requirement that Congress is the federal branch that determines when the country goes to war, supporters of unilateral executive power will often take one of two paths to avoid following the constitutional mandate that Congress declare war before the executive can wage it. First of all, they refer to as defensive. I'm not going to get into that right now, but they basically just make the excuse that they're just responding in defense. And you can read the article. There's a pretty decent response to it there. But the other one that's more germane to this discussion here is they refer to the action as something other than war. If they just say that, well, this doesn't qualify as the word war, then Congress doesn't need to take any action. The executive can do whatever the heck they want. But under the Constitution, a war is a war, whether they call it a war or something else. Here from Rob Nadelson, he's talking about the strikes or the military action in Libya over a decade ago now, but you can apply this to almost any modern conflict today that they don't call war, of course. The administration argues that the hostilities, because they're limited, do not rise to the level of war as the Constitution uses that word. So if it's not a war, then, well, Congress is helpful. We'll go to them. It'll be nice to get them on board, but we don't need them. We'll do whatever we want. And that's generally how they approach all of this stuff. But that position, Rob writes, is almost surely wrong. Founding era dictionaries and other sources, both legal and lay, tell us that when the Constitution was approved, war consisted of any hostilities initiated by a sovereign over opposition. Any hostilities. A single bomb, a single missile, a drone raid, a physical raid, small, large, it doesn't matter. These are all acts of war. And to some of the founders in certain situations, depending on the situation, even just merely withdrawing from a treaty could be seen as an act of war and thus a declaration that you are going to be in a conflict. Anyways, a very typical dictionary definition, Rob writes, was, and this is from Barlow's Law Dictionary of 1772 and 73, very well known at the time, the exercise of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. Rob said he found no suggestion in any source that operations of the kind the U.S. is conducting were anything but war. Here's how Samuel Adams summed it up, and I think it's perfect for today. In a letter to John Pitts in early 1776, how strangely will the tools of a tyrant pervert the plain meaning of words. We are literally surrounded by tyrants and their tools and, well, all the problems that go with that. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. And if you support the work that we're doing and you want to help us reach and teach more people about this kind of information, nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.